The world that shapes him is built on lines, clear boundaries, commands that move from center to perimeter without friction. A structure that promises safety through order and survival through obedience. In this world, chaos is treated as a moral failure, not a natural force. Power is tolerated only when it submits to purpose. From the beginning, the system rewards those who can contain themselves, those who turn instinct into discipline and emotion into silence. Cyclops emerges inside this architecture not as a rebel or a visionary, but as a stabilizing function. He is not designed to question the foundation. He is designed to hold it together. His presence signals control, continuity, and the promise that power can be trusted if it never strays. The visor is not just a tool. It is a contract, a visible agreement between destruction and restraint. What he carries behind his eyes is not merely force. It is consequence. Before crisis, before schism, the world operates on a quiet assumption. That duty is neutral. That obedience is virtuous. That leadership is proven by endurance rather than imagination. The narrative space around Cyclops reinforces this belief through repetition. He stands at the center of formations. He gives orders that others execute. He absorbs pressure so the structure can remain intact. The system does not ask what it costs him to remain unbroken. It only asks that he does. There is comfort in this arrangement, for the group, for the audience, for the culture that consumes these stories. Cyclops represents the fantasy that power can be clean if it is disciplined enough, that violence can be moral if it follows rules, that suffering can be justified if it preserves order. He becomes a symbol of institutional trust, the kind that reassures rather than inspires. Yet the tension is already present, embedded in the foundations. A power that cannot be expressed without destruction. A leader who cannot relax his guard without endangering others. A self that has learned to survive by never slipping. The system praises his reliability, but ignores the cost of perpetual control. It treats restraint as character rather than coping. It confuses endurance with wholeness. The stage is set long before the conflict reveals itself. The environment rewards consistency over reflection. It demands clarity in a world defined by mutation and uncertainty. Cyclops is elevated precisely because he reduces complexity. He turns chaos into strategy. He turns fear into procedure. The more volatile the world becomes, the more necessary he appears, and the more invisible his internal strain grows. He is not framed as tragic at first. Tragedy requires visible loss. Cyclops loses nothing publicly. He retains his position, his authority, his role. What erodes instead is less visible. The capacity to doubt, the freedom to imagine alternatives, the permission to fail without catastrophe. These losses do not register as wounds. They register as professionalism. Around him, other figures embody movement, contradiction, desire. They break rules and are forgiven. They struggle openly and are mythologized. Cyclops does not receive this narrative generosity. He is not allowed to unravel. He is allowed to function. The spotlight never leaves him, yet it reveals nothing intimate. He becomes a figure defined by posture rather than presence. The world mistakes this for strength, and so does he. The moral logic of the environment insists that someone must hold the line. Someone must bear the weight of impossible decisions. Someone must become the wall others lean on. Cyclops accepts this role not because it fulfills him, but because the alternative feels irresponsible. To let go would mean risk, and risk in this world is framed as betrayal. The tension remains quiet but constant, a pressure that does not explode but accumulates. The narrative does not rush toward collapse. It allows the weight to settle, The rules remain intact. The formations hold. Victory is achieved often enough to justify the method. From the outside, the system appears stable. Inside, something else is happening. Cyclops begins to operate less as a person and more as a function. His decisions grow sharper, narrower. His vision, both literal and symbolic, becomes increasingly focused. There is no space for ambiguity, no tolerance for deviation. The more responsibility he carries, the less flexibility he can afford. Control becomes not just a tactic, but an identity. The audience senses the imbalance before the story names it. There is a subtle unease in watching someone who never breaks. Not because breaking is virtuous, but because unbrokenness suggests suppression. A life lived entirely under command, even self-imposed command, begins to feel less like heroism and more like containment. The world around him shifts. Threats become more complex. Loyalties fracture. Ideals compete. The old rules no longer account for the new reality. And yet Cyclops remains loyal to the structure that formed him. He tightens discipline where adaptation is needed. He doubles down on order where negotiation might serve better. Not out of malice, out of faith. This is where the real conflict begins, though it remains unnamed. A system built on obedience collides with a reality that demands transformation. A leader shaped by restraint faces a world that no longer rewards it. Cyclops stands at the center of this contradiction, holding together a structure that is already cracking. He does not notice the fracture at first, or perhaps he notices and chooses not to see it. Either way, the visor stays on. The line holds. The cost continues to rise. This is not a story about rebellion yet. It is a story about endurance, about the invisible damage caused by never allowing oneself to bend, about a man who mistakes survival for stability and duty for destiny. The crisis has not arrived, but it is already inevitable. The system cannot remain as it is, and neither can he. Cyclops is born into fracture before he understands language. Loss precedes choice. Trauma arrives before identity has time to form. His world does not collapse in spectacle, it narrows. The absence of safety becomes the first rule he learns. Survival depends on containment. Expression equals danger. From the beginning, the self is experienced as something that must be managed rather than inhabited. His power reinforces this lesson with cruel precision. Vision, the most trusted sense, becomes the source of destruction. Seeing is no longer passive. It carries consequence. To look freely is to harm. The psyche adapts quickly. Control becomes not just practical, but moral. Discipline is framed as care. Restraint is framed as responsibility. The body learns before the mind can argue. This early configuration shapes everything that follows. Cyclops does not grow toward power, he grows around it. His identity is constructed as a perimeter. Rules are internalized not as external impositions, but as self-definition. He is safest when he obeys. He is most valuable when he functions. Desire becomes suspicious. Impulse becomes dangerous. Spontaneity is treated as a liability. The environment that later receives him recognizes this structure instantly. Institutions always do. He fits without friction because he has already molded himself into what systems require. Reliability, predictability, sacrifice without complaint. He does not threaten hierarchy because he believes in it. He does not disrupt order because he confuses it with meaning. This is where his contrast with others becomes essential. Around him exist figures shaped by rupture in different ways. Some turn trauma into defiance, others into creativity, others into withdrawal. Cyclops turns it into compliance, not submission to another person, but submission to structure. The difference is subtle but decisive. He does not ask who commands, only whether the command preserves order. Leadership arrives as an extension of this pattern. He leads because he endures, because he absorbs pressure without visible fracture, because he accepts responsibility without negotiating its cost. Authority is granted to him not because he inspires vision, but because he guarantees continuity. He becomes the center not by expansion, but by contraction. He reduces complexity so others can move freely. This role flatters him. It gives purpose to suffering. It transforms trauma into utility. The pain of restraint is no longer meaningless. It is productive. The psyche accepts this bargain eagerly. Better to suffer with purpose than to feel lost. Better to be necessary than to be free. The system rewards him with trust, and trust becomes his currency. Yet something essential is traded away in this exchange. The capacity to imagine alternatives. The willingness to tolerate uncertainty. The permission to want without justification. These are not violently removed. They simply atrophy. Cyclops becomes fluent in command, but illiterate in desire. He understands what must be done long before he understands what he feels. His relationship to authority reflects this internal configuration. He respects it not because it is benevolent, but because it provides orientation. Authority answers the question of direction. It resolves ambiguity. In a world defined by mutation and instability, this clarity feels sacred. He aligns himself with it instinctively, even when it becomes brittle. The moral framework that surrounds him reinforces this alignment. Obedience is coded as virtue. Discipline is framed as maturity. Doubt is treated as weakness. Cyclops absorbs these values without resistance because they echo his own internal logic. The external narrative and the internal structure mirror each other perfectly. There is no tension yet, only reinforcement. But the seeds of conflict are already present in this symmetry. A self built entirely around containment cannot adapt easily to transformation. A leader who equates control with care struggles to recognize when control becomes harm. The very traits that make Cyclops effective also make him rigid. The foundation is strong, but inflexible foundations crack under shifting weight. As threats evolve, the world demands not just coordination, but interpretation. Not just response, but judgment. Moral ambiguity enters the field. Decisions begin to carry costs that cannot be evenly distributed. Someone must decide who bears them. Cyclops accepts this burden automatically. It feels familiar. He has been bearing invisible costs his entire life. Other figures respond differently. They question. They resist. They improvise. They accept inconsistency as the price of freedom. To Cyclops, this behavior appears reckless. It threatens the fragile order he has spent his life maintaining. He interprets deviation as danger, not because it is always harmful, but because it undermines predictability. This is where relational tension begins to form. Not yet as open conflict, but as divergence. Cyclops values cohesion above all. Others value expression, autonomy, or moral flexibility. These differences are not personal. They are structural. They arise from different strategies for surviving a hostile world. The narrative does not frame Cyclops as villainous at this stage, nor as heroic in a traditional sense. He occupies a liminal space, necessary but uncomfortable, trusted but increasingly isolated. His authority grows as emotional proximity diminishes. Leadership becomes a solitary position. Decisions are made alone, even when executed collectively. Internally, this isolation reinforces his reliance on rules. When connection weakens, structure fills the gap. When intimacy becomes risky, procedure offers safety. Cyclops does not consciously choose this path. It unfolds logically from the architecture of his psyche. Each step feels justified. Each compromise feels temporary. Each sacrifice feels required. The environment responds by amplifying his role. As tensions rise, his decisiveness is praised. His severity is reframed as realism. His unwillingness to bend is described as strength. Cultural narratives often reward this posture during perceived crises. The leader who never hesitates becomes a symbol of security. But symbols flatten complexity. They demand consistency. Cyclops begins to perform himself, not inauthentically but rigidly. There is less room for internal debate, less tolerance for uncertainty. The identity hardens. The visor is no longer just protection, it is persona, a visible boundary between the self and the world. The conflict has not yet exploded, but the conditions are set. A man shaped by trauma has become the custodian of order. A system built on obedience faces realities that demand transformation. The foundations hold, but strain accumulates. Pressure does not announce itself. It compresses. Cyclops stands at the center of this compression, carrying a structure that no longer fits the world it governs, trusting rules that were designed for a simpler threat, believing that if he tightens control enough, chaos will recede. The tragedy is not that he is wrong. It is that he is only partially right. The psychological field is now fully formed. Forces are aligned. Values are defined. The stage is no longer stable. It is merely waiting. The first rupture does not arrive as betrayal or collapse. It arrives as escalation. The world grows louder. Threats no longer announce themselves at the perimeter. They emerge from within, from unresolved tensions, from ideological fractures that strategy alone cannot contain. The old formations still function, but they require greater force to maintain. Cyclops responds the only way he knows how. He reinforces the structure. Decisions begin to narrow. Options that once existed quietly disappear. Negotiation becomes delay. Compassion becomes risk. The line between protection and domination blurs, not because Cyclops seeks power for its own sake, but because power appears necessary to preserve coherence. He interprets increasing resistance as evidence that discipline must intensify. The more the system strains, the more tightly he grips it. Authority shifts subtly at this stage. It stops being shared and becomes centralized. Orders are no longer suggestions shaped by consensus, but directives shaped by calculation. Cyclops frames this as responsibility. Someone must decide. Someone must carry the weight of irreversible choices. His entire life has prepared him for this role. He steps into it without hesitation. The psychological cost of this shift is immediate but internal. Doubt is no longer entertained. It becomes a threat to operational clarity. Cyclops begins to distrust ambiguity itself. Moral gray areas feel like structural weaknesses. He responds by simplifying ethical questions into tactical ones. What ensures survival? What prevents collapse? What maintains order? This simplification has consequences. People become positions. Relationships become variables. Loyalty is measured not by shared history, but by alignment with the plan. Those who question decisions are not seen as dissenters, but as destabilizing forces. Cyclops does not experience this as cruelty. He experiences it as necessity. The environment reinforces this perception. Crisis rewards decisiveness. Success validates severity. Each victory achieved through tightened control becomes evidence that the approach works. The cost remains invisible because it is distributed unevenly. It is absorbed by those pushed to the margins, by those asked to compromise more than they can bear. Cyclops notices the outcomes, not the erosion. Internally, his identity contracts further. He no longer leads from within the group, but above it. Distance increases efficiency. It also increases isolation. The leader becomes a point of gravity rather than a participant. Others orbit him, adjusting their trajectories to avoid collision. The structure holds, but movement becomes strained. This stage marks a shift in perception for the audience as well. Cyclops is no longer simply reliable. He becomes severe. His moral certainty feels heavy. The question begins to surface, quietly at first. Is this protection, or is it control? The narrative does not answer. It allows the tension to accumulate. Cyclops himself remains convinced. He has learned to trust systems more than feelings. He believes that hesitation invites catastrophe. He remembers a childhood where a single uncontrolled moment destroyed everything. The lesson remains intact. Control is safety. Release is annihilation. Every decision is filtered through this lens. As polarization increases around him, alternatives emerge. Other figures propose different responses to the same pressures. They accept risk in exchange for adaptability. They tolerate inconsistency in pursuit of autonomy. To Cyclops, these approaches appear dangerously naive. He sees them as luxuries afforded by those who do not carry the full weight of responsibility. The conflict sharpens, not as open war yet, but as ideological divergence. The center tightens. The periphery resists. Cyclops stands immovable, believing still that endurance will outlast dissent, that order will absorb chaos if held firmly enough. He does not yet recognize that pressure does not always dissipate. Sometimes it fractures. The first stage of transformation is complete. The system has shifted from coordination to control, from shared purpose to enforced alignment. Cyclops has crossed a threshold without marking it. He has not become something else. He has become more fully himself. And that is precisely the danger. The second rupture is quieter, but more decisive. It unfolds not through open opposition, but through the slow withdrawal of trust. Where once Cyclops was seen as the axis around which the group could organize itself, he now becomes a fixed point that others must work around. Coordination turns into compliance. Dialogue becomes notification. The system still functions, but its center is no longer shared. Cyclops senses this shift, even if he does not name it. The atmosphere around him feels thinner. Conversations end sooner. Decisions are accepted without engagement. What he interprets as discipline is also distance. The structure has begun to hollow out from the inside. Authority remains, but allegiance weakens. He responds by formalizing control even further, believing that clarity will restore cohesion. This is where polarization hardens. The field no longer allows middle ground. One either aligns with the architecture Cyclops represents or exists outside it. Neutrality disappears. The center defines itself by exclusion, not explicitly but functionally. Those who do not fit the logic of containment become liabilities. Cyclops does not banish them in anger. He sidelines them through necessity. Power at this stage no longer feels provisional. It crystallizes. Decisions accumulate history. Each uncompromising choice narrows the path back. Cyclops begins to operate in a world shaped by his previous actions. Alternatives are no longer theoretical. They are foreclosed. The system he commands now reflects him completely, rigid, efficient, unforgiving. Internally, a subtle transformation occurs. Responsibility shifts from burden to justification. The weight he carries becomes proof of correctness. Sacrifice becomes evidence of moral authority. The more he gives up, the more convinced he becomes that deviation would invalidate everything already lost. The past locks the future into place. Other figures perceive this transformation differently. What Cyclops calls resolve, they experience as domination. What he frames as protection, they feel as suffocation. The same actions generate radically different meanings depending on where one stands within the structure. The narrative allows this asymmetry to remain unresolved. There is no neutral vantage point. Conflict begins to surface openly now, not always as confrontation, but as resistance. Orders are followed with hesitation. Strategies are questioned after execution. Trust erodes in subtle ways. Cyclops responds by tightening oversight. The feedback loop accelerates. Control produces resistance. Resistance justifies more control. This dynamic reshapes Cyclops himself. He becomes increasingly intolerant of unpredictability. Surprise feels like threat. Innovation feels like defiance. He retreats deeper into procedure. His language sharpens. His vision narrows. The visor becomes heavier, both literally and symbolically. It no longer simply restrains power. It defines perception. The audience witnesses a shift in moral framing here. Cyclops is no longer merely severe. He becomes frightening in his certainty, not because he seeks cruelty, but because he no longer questions the legitimacy of his position. The system he leads feels inevitable to him. Alternatives appear irresponsible, even immoral. The narrative tension peaks in this recognition. The tragedy is not that Cyclops lacks empathy. It is that empathy no longer guides decision-making. It has been subordinated to structure. Care is expressed through enforcement. Protection through limitation. He believes he is preventing collapse. He does not see that the collapse has already begun, not in spectacle but in trust. The second stage closes with a decisive shift. Cyclops stands fully identified with the system he commands. There is no meaningful separation between leader and structure. Criticism of one becomes an attack on the other. The possibility of reform diminishes rapidly. The center has hardened into a wall. What comes next cannot be negotiated. It can only break or be broken. The third rupture arrives as inevitability rather than shock. By the time open fracture becomes visible, the outcome has already been decided by accumulation. Choices layered upon choices have reduced the field to two incompatible realities. One organized around control as survival, the other around transformation as necessity. Cyclops stands firmly inside the first, not because he is blind to change, but because change threatens the logic that has sustained him. When confrontation finally surfaces, it does not feel like rebellion to him. It feels like irresponsibility, like abandonment disguised as principle. The moral language on both sides mirrors itself: protection versus freedom, order versus growth, duty versus self-determination. Each claims the future. Each accuses the other of courting disaster. The symmetry is unsettling because it reveals how deeply the conflict is rooted in shared origins. Cyclops escalates not out of anger, but out of conviction. He believes that hesitation at this stage would collapse everything he has held together. The weight of the past presses forward. Every sacrifice already made demands continuity. To break now would not simply be a change in strategy. It would be an admission that the cost was unnecessary. That is a truth he cannot afford to face. Power reaches its most concentrated form here. Surveillance increases. Enforcement sharpens. The language of necessity replaces the language of choice entirely. Cyclops frames his actions as containment of a spreading instability. He does not experience himself as tyrannical. He experiences himself as the last barrier between order and ruin. The psychological transformation completes itself in this phase. Cyclops no longer distinguishes between his internal restraint and the external force he applies. Control has become moralized fully. The self is now indistinguishable from the role. To question the structure would be to dissolve identity itself. The visor is no longer protection. It is definition. Those who oppose him sense this shift immediately. Dialogue collapses. Appeals to shared history fail. What remains is force meeting force, not necessarily in physical terms, but in symbolic posture. The center asserts itself as immovable. The periphery pushes back not to replace it, but to escape its gravity. The narrative refuses simple alignment. Cyclops is not exposed as malicious. His logic remains coherent. His fear is legible. The horror lies precisely in how reasonable he appears from within his frame. This is not madness. It is clarity taken to excess, consistency hardened into compulsion. The consequences unfold quickly once the line is crossed. Trust collapses openly. Allegiances fracture. The system that once promised safety through order now produces instability through rigidity. Cyclops responds by tightening further, unable to recognize that the strategy has inverted itself. The more he enforces, the more resistance grows. The cycle feeds on itself. At the center of this collapse stands a man who has never allowed himself to break, and now finds that unbrokenness offers no exit. He cannot retreat without undoing himself. He cannot advance without destroying what remains. The structure demands continuation, even as it erodes its own foundation. The audience perceives the full cost here, not just political or strategic, but existential. Cyclops has become a symbol of what happens when duty is stripped of self-reflection, when obedience replaces judgment, when endurance is mistaken for integrity. His tragedy is not that he chose wrong once. It is that he never allowed himself to choose at all. The third stage closes not with resolution, but with crystallization. Positions harden permanently. The system splits into irreconcilable forms. Cyclops remains at the center of one, absolute, coherent, unsustainable. The collapse does not end the conflict. It locks it into myth. What follows is no longer about events. It is about meaning. By the time Cyclops becomes a figure of open contention, the narrative has already exceeded the boundaries of individual psychology. What unfolds around him is no longer a personal tragedy, but a cultural pattern made visible. He stops functioning solely as a character and begins operating as a symbolic structure, a condensation of anxieties surrounding power, leadership, and moral certainty in unstable worlds. The story no longer asks whether he is right or wrong. It asks why figures like him emerge when they do, and why they are both trusted and feared. Cyclops occupies a specific cultural space. He is the leader who never performs rebellion, the authority figure who never flirts with chaos. In a genre saturated with charismatic transgressors, he represents something colder and more unsettling. Institutional continuity, the promise that order can survive crisis without transforming itself. This promise resonates deeply in moments when systems feel threatened, when complexity overwhelms imagination, when fear demands clarity. The audience response to Cyclops reflects this tension precisely. He is rarely adored, but frequently defended. Rarely inspirational, but often invoked as necessary. He becomes the character people argue about rather than identify with. This is not accidental. Culturally, Cyclops functions as a projection screen for collective ambivalence toward authority. He embodies the desire for protection without compromise, alongside the suspicion that such protection always carries hidden costs. His conflict radiates outward, shaping how the entire narrative universe is perceived. Structures once framed as benevolent begin to appear coercive. Rules once accepted as stabilizing reveal their exclusionary edges. The world reorganizes itself around the question Cyclops forces into visibility. How much control is justified in the name of survival? And who decides when that threshold has been crossed? This symbolic function extends beyond the fictional universe into the audience's interpretive space. Cyclops becomes a mirror for real-world tensions between security and autonomy, between institutional trust and systemic critique. Viewers recognize the pattern, even if they cannot name it. The disciplined leader who becomes indistinguishable from the system he serves. The moral clarity that hardens into inflexibility. The protective impulse that evolves into domination. Importantly, the narrative refuses to isolate this dynamic within villainy. Cyclops is not coded as corrupt in the traditional sense. He does not seek personal gain. He does not indulge excess. His authority is austere. This restraint makes his trajectory more disturbing, not less. It suggests that harm does not require malice, only certainty sustained without interruption. The symbolic weight of Cyclops also emerges through contrast. Characters who oppose him are often framed as emotionally expressive, ideologically fluid, or morally exploratory. They embody movement rather than structure. Their appeal lies in adaptability, empathy, and risk. The cultural imagination splits along these lines. Stability versus change. Control versus emergence. Safety versus growth. This polarization does not resolve into a moral hierarchy. Instead, it reveals a deeper cultural ambivalence. The desire for order persists even when its failures are exposed. The fear of chaos remains powerful even when control proves destructive. Cyclops stands at the center of this contradiction, absorbing both admiration and resentment without release. The visual symbolism surrounding him reinforces this role. The visor becomes an icon of mediated perception, power that cannot be seen directly, vision that must be filtered to remain acceptable. In cultural terms, this resonates with broader anxieties about how institutions see and act. Who controls perception? Who decides what is visible? What must be restrained to preserve collective safety? The narrative environment amplifies these symbols through repetition. Cyclops is positioned at the center of formations, behind command structures, above tactical maps. He occupies the architectural heart of the story, the center that organizes space, the gravity that shapes movement. When this center hardens, the entire system warps around it. The story makes this distortion visible not through exposition, but through consequence. Audience reactions reflect a form of symbolic splitting. Some viewers interpret Cyclops as a tragic necessity, others as a cautionary figure. This divergence mirrors the conflict itself. The story does not correct either reading. It allows the ambiguity to persist, recognizing that cultural myths endure precisely because they resist singular interpretation. In this way, Cyclops joins a lineage of modern mythic figures who embody the danger of unexamined virtue, leaders whose moral certainty becomes indistinguishable from coercion, guardians who confuse protection with possession. These figures recur across cultural narratives because they articulate a persistent fear that the systems designed to keep us safe may ultimately demand more obedience than we can ethically provide. The medium through which this story circulates intensifies its impact. Serialized storytelling allows the slow accumulation of tension. Visual repetition reinforces symbolic roles. Audience familiarity with genre expectations sharpens the subversion. Cyclops looks like a traditional leader, sounds like one, behaves like one. and yet the outcome unsettles precisely because it emerges logically from those traits. This is not a story about extremism. It is a story about moderation taken too far, about balance calcifying into rigidity, about duty losing contact with humanity. The cultural power of Cyclops lies in this specificity. He does not represent chaos. He represents order that cannot bend. As a result, his conflict lingers in the collective imagination long after particular storylines conclude. He becomes shorthand for a certain kind of authority, the kind that appears responsible until it becomes suffocating, the kind that feels safe until it demands silence, the kind that survives crisis but cannot imagine life beyond it. This is why Cyclops remains a contested figure, not because his actions are unclear, but because the values they represent are unresolved within the culture itself. He embodies a question that refuses closure. How much obedience is too much? And what happens when the one who never breaks becomes the thing that must be broken? The conflict no longer belongs to him alone. It has become a cultural pattern, a myth of containment, and like all effective myths, it continues to operate long after the story moves on. What remains after the fracture is not ruin, but sediment. The conflict does not dissolve into reconciliation or defeat. It settles into the landscape as a permanent formation. Cyclops does not disappear from the narrative world. He persists as a structure that has survived its own crisis, altered but intact. The system he embodied may shift shape, but its logic continues to circulate through memory, institutions, and myth. Cyclops himself is no longer experienced as a man in the aftermath. He becomes a reference point, a measure against which other forms of leadership are judged. He is invoked whenever discipline is praised, whenever sacrifice is demanded without negotiation, whenever stability is valued over transformation. His presence lingers as an echo rather than an actor. The story has moved forward, but his gravity remains. The cost of never breaking becomes legible only in retrospect. Not as regret expressed openly, but as absence. Cyclops does not reclaim what was lost. He does not recover flexibility, intimacy, or doubt. Those capacities were not stolen from him by enemies. They were surrendered slowly in exchange for coherence. The aftermath reveals that what was traded cannot be repurchased once the transaction is complete. This permanence is crucial to his symbolic function. Cyclops is not redeemed through collapse, nor punished through erasure. He endures. The unbroken leader remains standing even when the world around him reorganizes. This endurance is unsettling because it suggests that certain forms of power do not fail visibly. They persist quietly, normalized by familiarity and justified by precedent. The legacy of Cyclops is therefore not caution alone, but continuity. He represents the idea that systems built on obedience can survive moral challenge by absorbing it, by reframing dissent as instability, by converting critique into proof of necessity. In this way, the conflict he embodies does not resolve. It institutionalizes itself. Within the narrative universe, future generations inherit his imprint without fully understanding its origin. Procedures remain. Command structures persist. The language of necessity survives even when the original threat has changed. Cyclops becomes part of the foundation, a silent architecture beneath new stories. His decisions shape outcomes long after he stops making them. For the audience, this legacy operates at a psychological level. Cyclops becomes a figure people return to when questioning their own relationship to duty. He haunts discussions of leadership, morality, and responsibility, not because he offers answers, but because he exposes the cost of certain answers taken too far. He forces recognition of a difficult truth. that unyielding integrity can become indistinguishable from harm. There is no catharsis here, no moment where the narrative allows release. The absence of emotional resolution is deliberate. Cyclops functions as a reminder rather than a lesson. Lessons imply correction. Reminders persist. They resurface whenever conditions align, whenever fear demands certainty, whenever complexity feels unbearable. In this sense, Cyclops joins the category of myths that do not conclude. He is not a fallen hero or a corrupted guardian. He is something more uncomfortable, a figure who did everything right according to the rules he was given and still produced damage. This ambiguity ensures his permanence. Clear villains fade. Ambiguous necessities endure. The visor remains the most enduring image. Not removed, not shattered, still in place. Power continues to be filtered. Vision remains controlled. The world is safer, perhaps, or at least more predictable. But something essential has been permanently constrained. The story leaves that tension unresolved, not as failure, but as fidelity to its own logic. Cyclops does not ask to be forgiven. He does not repent. He stands by what was done because to do otherwise would unravel the entire structure of meaning he inhabits. This refusal is not arrogance. It is survival at the level of identity. To admit fracture now would mean acknowledging that the self was built on suppression rather than strength. And so the legacy holds, not as warning alone, but as presence. Cyclops remains a figure who never broke, and in doing so revealed the hidden cost of unbrokenness. The story does not ask the audience to choose against him. It asks them to recognize him, in systems, in leaders, in themselves.